one thing that I will emphasize is that creativity and inner transformation are two different sides to the same coin. And when we think about it that way, really opens up a lot of doors of new possibility. Okay. So I will say right off the bat, and I say this in episode 62, that there are very few studies that have been published that focus on the effects that psychedelics have on creativity. So the results have also been mixed. More and more, this is becoming more of a topic of interest. But right now, so much of the research has been focused on psychedelics and mental illness because it's really paving the pathway for legalization, for FDA approval. There's a lot of reasons for that. I am going to make a case that I think that this topic is just as important for many reasons as it is to focus on psychedelics and mental illness. So from my perspective, I don't feel like we need to wait for science to validate what we intuitively know to be true. Okay. So, and I talk about this as well in episode number 62, and I go in depth into more of my perspective about this. So there's questions that we can ask. One of them is, can psychedelics enhance creativity? To me, this is an interesting question, but it's not the question. If we look at, can psychedelics enhance creativity, we can start looking at what we intuitively know to be true. If we look at the 60s and 70s and we see so many different ways that creativity flourished as a result of people starting to consume LSD, it's pretty obvious, from works of art to musicians, to say the least, that yes, psychedelics can enhance creativity. So from a more science perspective, for those of you who are not familiar with Kary Mullis, he was one of the only people, he won a Nobel Prize. And in an interview with BBC, he said, I seriously doubt that I would have invented PCR, which is what he won a Nobel Prize for, the polymerase chain reaction, if I hadn't taken LSD. So that's really interesting. Some of you might have heard this famous quote by Steve Jobs that said, taking LSD was a profound experience, one of the most important in my life. And then he went on to invent the iPhone after that experience. And then, of course, we can look to indigenous traditions. And when you look at the artwork that Shipibo lineage, for example, are making and creating highly intricate patterns, it's pretty remarkable and not a very far-fetched to connect the dots between these profound experiences altering our state of consciousness and enhanced creativity in all of its forms. On a personal level, I'll say that everything that I've created in my adult life, so I've been journeying for 25 years, and everything of significance that I've created was woven into my own practice with psychedelics and sacred plant medicine. So this is a photo of me soaking in a volcanic hot spring. I built a volcanic hot spring retreat center on the Big Island of Hawaii. That came through a very profound vision that I had. And we'll talk about these different perspectives of creativity. One perspective is that creativity is how we translate ideas into reality. Okay. So I've been teaching workshops and teaching classes on psychedelics and transformation for many years. I taught my first microdosing workshop probably about 10 years ago now. And about 5 years ago, I realized and I recognized that very few people were, I can't see anyone else. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep this slide up. As long as you can see me, that's great. So about 5 years ago, I started asking myself this really interesting question around psychedelics and creativity. And I've noticed that very few people were talking about it. There are very few papers written about it. And I came across a paper by Manesh Gurn, who I've also interviewed on the podcast twice, just recently as well. And he wrote a paper on exploring the intersection between psychedelics and creativity, updating the dynamic framework of thought. I'm happy to share with it the link in the chat. But if you also look up Manesh Gurn, Psychedelic Leadership Podcast, you'll see a whole interview on this. So what I decided to do, and at this point, I'd already been running retreats for about 12 years, teaching curriculum, and I felt like this piece around psychedelics and creativity was a huge missing piece in my frameworks and my curriculum. And I started also coming across some really powerful statements that I was reading from thought leaders, from organizations like the World Economic Forum, that said that creativity is now becoming the #1 most important skill set of our time. And I remember when I first started reading that and looking at that, I asked myself, well, am I creative? What does this even mean? How do we measure this? And I think, like many of us here, we have a deeply entrenched, old, outdated belief systems about what it means to be creative. And it's interesting. I like to joke that, psychedelics and creativity are both going through a massive cultural rebrand right now. That, what we think about psychedelics is drastically changing. And I could talk about that topic for hours. And what we think about creativity is also changing. Okay. So before I go on, so I went back to graduate school and I got a master's of science in creativity studies and change leadership. And what I did was I spent my time there rereading the hundreds of papers, scientific papers that were specifically focused on the intersection between psychedelics and mental illness. And I looked at that research through the lens of creativity research, what I was understanding about creativity from an academic and scientific perspective. And it was super fascinating because what I realized and what I wrote my thesis on and what I now have been teaching on for quite a few years is that when we look under the hood, and I'll go deeper into this in today's session, but when we look under the hood, what we can say is that many of the same reasons that we're pointing to that explain or starting to explain, we're really just scratching the surface as to why psychedelics are efficacious in the treatment of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction. A lot of those same reasons can be applied to enhancing creativity, creative cognition, creative thinking, okay? We don't normally think about it from that perspective. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from today's talk. And I'm going to reinforce that point a few times. I also interviewed Dennis McKenna, episode number 38, about psychedelics and creativity, creative cognition specifically. And Dennis says, psychedelics are tools for learning, tools for helping us how to learn to think more creatively. That's the core of it. And that's really a core message because, as I'll explain, when we are in a ruminative pattern of depression, let's say, we're in ruminative thinking patterns. It's like being a hamster in a wheel. You need to choose a new thought to step off the hamster wheel of ruminative thinking to free yourself from depression or addiction. The same can be said about creativity, about finding novel, original solutions to solving the problem at hand. Okay. So the question, can psychedelics enhance creativity? From my perspective, and over 2 decades of journeying and my life, many, many, many other people's lives being a living testament to this being true, I will still say that it will depend on a few factors, big factors. It will depend on some of our major hidden assumptions. It will depend on your own beliefs about creativity. One hidden assumption, and this is linked to our frames of reference. As I mentioned, the narrative that is paving the pathway for psychedelics to enter Western mainstream culture, which is happening right now in a big way, the narrative that's paving that pathway is through a medicalized lens. We're going to talk more about that. And that has a big impact. It influences our frame of reference, how we approach these medicines, and it influences everything from preparation to integration to set and setting. Okay. I'll also say that, and I'll come back to that point. We'll talk more about that. But before I move on, I want to highlight that our beliefs about creativity have huge impacts. Research shows that about 50% of people don't believe themselves to be creative because we're still rooted in the old, outdated myths. Some of those myths. And as I'm sharing some of these, what are your own beliefs about creativity? what are some of the initial things that you immediately think about when you think about creativity? What immediately comes to mind? Sometimes I play a word association game where I'll say the word creativity and then ask people in the audience, and I've done this with like 1,000 people, to scream back at me what's the first thing that comes to mind. And it's always so fascinating. Most of it is around aesthetics, around conventional ways of thinking about creativity. If I'm not writing poetry, if I'm not a dancer, then I'm not creative. If I'm not a musician, sometimes I'll hear people, and I play this with Uber drivers all the time, word association games. And sometimes people will say, I heard one Uber driver recently say back to me, I said creativity, and he responded, not me. And that's really unfortunate, because when we think that we're not creative, it impacts what we pursue in our lives. And that makes sense, right? But research has been done on this, and it shows that if you don't think yourself creative, then you are going to be less effective at creative problem solving. And from my perspective, we are living in a time where creative thinking and creative problem solving are the most important skill sets that we can learn how to cultivate to navigate the fourth industrial revolution, which many people are not totally clued into the fact that we have moved into the fourth industrial revolution, which is dominated by technology, and artificial intelligence is really changing the game in huge, huge ways right now. Okay. I'll also say level of experience. And this is a huge topic too, because I think the best analogy is, and I use this analogy a lot, because creative cognition is a practice, and we're not taught those practices. It's just like learning to play guitar. So for many of you, if you've never sat in ceremony before, and then you go and sit in your first ayahuasca journey, and in that journey, you're just totally, your mind is like completely being spun around. You're totally disoriented. That's normal. That's a normal experience. And yet you realize that the person holding space is playing guitar, and they're playing very intricate, advanced levels of music that you can't even comprehend. But if you go back to the ceremony, then you start to learn to hum the songs, and maybe you start to learn the words, and you start to sing the songs. And if you sit in ceremony for years, you learn to sit up. You learn to navigate psychedelic space, which is truly a skill set. We don't think about it that way, but it's really helpful to think about it from that perspective. And I can't even tell you how many people didn't have a musical bone in their body, and then they go and sit in ayahuasca ceremonies, and after 3 months, they're picking up the guitar. And that's just one form of creativity. But I use that example because just like becoming more dexterity, what's the word? Dexterous? No, that's not the word, but having enhanced dexterity in your fingers and having more ability to coordinate your mind with your body and play a rhythm and sing songs, be cognizant in that experience. The same can be applied to creative cognition and how we think about generating ideas, the way we think about combining ideas, that there is a whole world that's available to us, but we don't think about it from that perspective. And so your level of experience plays a big difference. That's part of the issue that I have with a lot of the studies on psychedelics and creativity, because if you're not training people, like when I do a training with a company, for example, and I'm working with someone, a team of people that have never trained in divergent thinking, for example, it's night and day. It's completely different than working with people who have been trained in certain creative thinking skills. Their capacity to generate novel, original ideas to solve a problem at hand is tenfold people who haven't been trained. So skill set, level of experience, level of training, these all play a huge, huge role in how we navigate psychedelic space. Okay.